Hello. This is Beginnings, written by W.J. May, narrated by Zach Smith. That's me. Prologue. I never planned for this to happen. If there's one thing you could say for us, it's that we didn't plan much. Nothing we did was intended. All of our greatest moments, the bitterest of heartbreaks, and most thrilling of adventures seemed random strokes of luck. Eden wouldn't call it luck. He'd call it the stars. Those little drips of fortune were etched into the cosmos long before any of us were born. The story is already written, he'd always say. There's no point in avoiding such things. The only thing that's left is to play our part. Well, we played our part. And I'd like to think we did it well. Chapter 1.
Those fishheads aren't going to chop themselves.
The girl stared down at her hands, pale from too little sunlight, scarred from cooking over an open fire. Beneath the grease stains were calluses reserved for those who gripped reins all day, or devoted their lives to the swing of a sword. She'd gotten hers from decapitating fish.
Kiera!
She startled back to the present as a door swung open, and the sounds of a crowded tavern filtered inside. A discordant chorus of voices punctuated every few seconds with a deafening shout for more ale. Those two words haunted her dreams. It didn't help that she slept above the tavern.
Nice of you to join us.
The man scowling in the doorway could hardly be counted as a man at all. While the general shape was there, he was sporting an extra 3 feet in every direction. It made him invaluable as the proprietor of such a rowdy establishment, and somewhat difficult when it came to stairs.
The fish,
he repeated slowly, as if she couldn't be counted on to remember.
I needed that stew to be ready ages ago. The people are hungry.
That stew will make them ill. Instead of voicing this opinion aloud, she gave a sarcastic salute and poured a bucket of freshly caught trout upon the counter, grabbing a cleaver as the man slipped back through the door. I shouldn't have done that. Her cheeks flushed with belated guilt as she gave the blade a cursory rinse. She was lucky to have a job. So many people didn't. Since scraping its way through an especially bleak winter, work in the tiny village had been scarce. Fortunately, for all his menace and bluster, the proprietor was actually a good man. He kept her on staff, and no matter what might be happening in the rest of the world, there remained a universal truth. People always needed a drink. With the skilled hands of one who'd done it many times before, she positioned the fish and swung the blade fiercely, imagining each one to be the face of a recent patron. A goblin who tried to walk out on his bill, a shifter who'd grabbed her around the waist as she tried to pass by. There were more than enough to keep her occupied, and before long she was merrily hacking away, dreaming now of bigger things, ogres and giants and trolls. Some people might fend them off with swords and spears, but she didn't need anything more than her handy cleaver. They fell, one after the other, crumbling to the floor in a revolting display of gore and blood. Some tried to flee in terror before feeling the kiss of her deadly blade. Some were screaming for more ale. She paused with the cleaver still raised above her, a ribbon of piscine blood trailing up the inside of her arm. The fish were quickly abandoned, dumped into a large pot as she hurried out of the kitchen and back to the main bar, grabbing 2 pitchers as she went. Marcel, her fellow bartender, was in the corner with some fishermen, trying to settle what was quickly escalating into a violent dispute. Talbot, the proprietor, had taken his place behind the bar, watching the crowd with one eye as the other measured drinks.
Busy night,
he murmured, unfazed by the general clamour as he continued to pour.
Did you finish with the fish?
She swept up beside him, tying back her hair. I annihilated them. He chuckled under his breath, flicking a piece of tail from her shoulder, then quickly easing the frothing pitchers from her hand.
It's too festive out there tonight. Why don't you stay behind the counter? Pour the whiskey. Let me handle the ale.
Festive. Tavern code for dangerous. It was the word they used when it was a little too full, tempers were a little too heated, and the men had already been served a little too much drink. Marcel had no such codes, but he didn't need them. The man was part shifter. "Are you sure?" she asked, trying to hide her relief. "It's no problem." The man nodded, squinting slightly, like he'd gotten something in his eye. It was a dance they'd done many times. A brusque series of grunts and deflections, hiding the affection beneath. He was gone a moment later, leaving her alone behind the bar. Pour the whiskey. The first time she'd wandered into such an establishment several years before, she'd felt each layer of chaos and mayhem like it was a tangible thing. An invisible mist that could be shoved aside when necessary, or, left untended, would suffocate as it swelled to envelop the entire room. She remembered being almost knocked down by the force of it, as if the swelling crescendo of impatient voices and the frenetic energy underneath was a gale strong enough to blow her away. Of course, she'd only been 10 or 11 at the time, highly susceptible to such nonsense. The subsequent years had hardened her, the way life in a village hardened everyone, like a new stone left to tumble slowly down the length of a well. You'd be smooth once you reached the bottom, but you could never see the sunlight quite the same. There was a swell in the general commotion as the door was flung open and a group of shifters was swept inside. Most of them tended to stay on the eastern side of the forest with the rest of their pack, but in a rare bit of cooperation, they were helping the villagers clear some of the trees that had fallen in a recent storm. They were being well paid for their efforts. The whiskey would be on the house. "By the gods!" a raven-haired man detached from the rest of them, collapsing onto a rickety bar stool with a roguish wink. "I believe you're even lovelier than the last time I saw you." Kiera flashed a tight smile, already reaching for the bottle. "Can I get you a shot?" He caught her wrist, grinning all the while. "Only if you pour one for yourself." Her eyes flickered down to his fingers, but that fixed smile remained. There were many levels of escalation that needed to happen before she would consider calling for someone. Most of those levels could be deflected with little more than a smile and a drink. But then who would be steady enough to hold the bottle?" she asked teasingly, tapping her head as though she'd thought it through. "It's the start of a long night. We must think ahead." He laughed louder than was appropriate, already having downed a pint of ale on the walk over. Those fingers loosened of their own accord, pointing to his own head in solidarity. Then he picked up the drink and shoved down a few seats further to make room for the others. They took no notice of the girl behind the counter. They were caught in a story instead.
"Wedged in the fork of 2 redwoods. Heavy it was, and covered in such thick branches we could not dislodge it with all our combined might."
"And you summoned the men from—"
"Yes, we summoned the men from Alga, but it wasn't enough," the storyteller replied impatiently. "But listen, that's not the point. A deer wandered out from the forest. No idea why it didn't shy from the noise. The thing must have been a touch mad. It walked straight up to us, sniffing at the air, pausing a moment beneath the trees. And that's when the thing gave way." He slapped the countertop to a roar of surprise from the others. "I've never seen an animal move so fast," he continued, wiping his face. "But its hind legs were pinned, and the front could do nothing but scramble. Oh, you should have heard the squeals." There was a bark of laughter as the wolves bantered amongst themselves, never bothered by such things. The rest of the tavern continued on as usual. Only the girl had frozen in place. "What happened to the deer?" she asked without thinking. She usually tried to keep free of such conversations, but her curiosity had been piqued.
The man who had been speaking looked up in surprise, not realizing she'd been listening along to the story. His eyes swept her up and down, before answering, resting on certain parts.
"We cut its throat. It's drying out in the village barn."
She blinked, then smiled. "Try the soup." The rest of the night passed in similar fashion, an increasingly intoxicated parade of people who blurred the line between man and beast. That mist was there, pulsing as though it had a life of its own, but she was skilled at navigating it by now. She simply kept out of the way, doing exactly what she was supposed to, smiling, diverting, pouring the drinks. There were times her mind wandered away completely, and she was anchored only by the practiced movement of her hands. Oddly enough, there was something almost serene about it. Unlike all those other times of the day, folding the beds, washing the linens, gathering food for breakfast, no one was speaking directly to her, asking things that required more than a quick dip of the wrist. She could detach until the clamour was nothing more than a distant hum, revelling in the quiet peace of her own thoughts. The deer was an ache, one that would linger long after the men were sleeping off the night's follies. She had always been overly attached to such things, courting with instant sentimentality. Perhaps I could search that part of the woods in the morning, she thought to herself, hands flitting over the various bottles. Make sure it wasn't a mother who left behind some young. I could even... May I get a shot of whiskey? She turned in surprise, staring at the man who just sat down at the counter. His accent was unfamiliar, as were his manners. "I'm sorry?" she echoed, forcing herself back to the present. His eyes twinkled as his lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Oh, you're miles away. Why don't you tell me about it?" he asked cheerfully, leaning back in his chair. "Then we can be there together." She blinked quickly. Sure, she must have misheard. The village was smaller than most, but situated close enough to a major road to receive the occasional traders or merchants as they passed through. The tavern was home to them all, and over the years she'd made a delighted study of every creature who stepped through its doors. But she had never seen this man before. She would have remembered. "We can be there together," she repeated, eyes drifting over the mop of golden curls and dimpled cheeks. "I'm sorry, have we wandered into a play?" He let out a burst of laughter, unconcerned with the people bustling around. "Perhaps just a whiskey then. I can soothe my wounded pride." She smiled at this, perhaps her only genuine smile since the moment she'd woken up. They locked eyes for a fleeting moment as she poured the thick amber liquid into a glass. It wasn't just the accent, though that alone was peculiar. And it wasn't just his clothes, though they were fitted in a way she didn't recognize. Everything about the man, from his handsome face to the way his fingers wrapped around the glass, everything was something new. "My name is Charles." He ignored the drink and extended his hand. She hesitated a moment, then shook it. "Kiera." It was the first time in longer than she could remember that she'd been the one to reach across the counter. Most days were spent politely fending off people that were reaching the opposite way towards her. Marcel glanced up across the room, throwing her a questioning look. She waved him off with a discreet flick of her fingers, flashing the man another tentative smile. "Are you helping with the repairs from the storm?" She looked him over curiously, lingering on the strange rings adorning the fingers of both hands. "I haven't seen you with the rest of the shifters." "You haven't seen me with them because I'm not a wolf," he said plainly, downing half the whiskey in a single shot. "But I suspect you already knew that." She leaned back in surprise, freezing with a towel in hand. "What do you mean?" "You're standing behind the bar," he answered, studying her with the same irrepressible smile. "The person behind the bar notices everything." An unlikely observation. She went out on a limb. "Have you ever done it yourself?" He nodded once, swirling the rest of his drink. For a few months when I was younger, you must be quite the woman, he mused, never taking his eyes from hers. To stand on your own in a crowd such as this. Even as he spoke, a fight broke out between two men on the far side of the tavern. A clumsy, drunken brawl that overturned the table where they were sitting and sent a spray of glass and ale flying across the room. Their companion shouted in alarm, then laughed uncontrollably. Talbot closed his eyes with a grimace, heading off to find the broom. It isn't always so bad, she lied easily, pouring 2 replacement pints that were quickly whisked away. The wolves are a bit enthusiastic, especially when they've had a few drinks. But for the most part, we serve only the local villagers, people I've known all my life. He considered this a moment, then shook his head with a frown. But wouldn't that make it harder? At least with the shifters, there's a level of anonymity between you, along with the counter. They come only for the drinks, not to force conversation. Again, unlikely. She raised her eyebrows delicately, flashing an innocent smile. You think a stranger cannot force conversation? He laughed quietly, bowing his head. Fair point.
Kiera!
Talbot called from across the room, kneeling on the floor and trying to clean up the broken glass as the shifters cavorted around him.
Can I get a little?
Yes, I'm coming. She snatched up another towel and joined him without a second thought, sinking to the floor and mopping up the larger puddles of ale as he swept away glittering shards of glass and threw them into a bin. It was the 3rd pair of cups that had been broken that week. This in a time where such things were costly and hard to acquire. She was surprised he hadn't already started.
Bloody animals,
he growled under his breath, shooting vicious glances at anyone who would dare challenge him.
We should feed them in troughs outside.
There it is. She laughed nervously, following his gaze. Come now, you don't mean that. You can't deny they liven up the place. They also have damn good hearing, even when drunk. Especially when drunk. Talbot made a derisive noise, thoroughly unconcerned with such things. The man was built roughly along the lines of a small yak. He could afford to be invested in tumblers, not reprisals.
I'm surprised you even noticed,
he muttered, knocking aside a chair to extract a far-flung piece of glass.
Here I thought you could see no further than the dandy at the bar.
The dandy? She snorted with a grin. How old are you? Their eyes met and the grin faded. I mean, why did you call him that? The man sat back on his heels, huffing with exertion. He pulled a cloth from his pocket, wiping it across his brow, before casting a quick look back towards the counter.
Nice shoes, nice clothes, soft hands.
He turned back to the floorboards, giving them a merciless sweep with the broom.
He also wears more jewellery than my wife.
Having met Talbot's wife, this was not surprising. She decided to keep this opinion to herself. He actually seems rather sweet, she murmured, almost to herself. Sweet being a relative term. At the very least, he isn't boasting about eviscerating helpless forest creatures. Talbot shot her a strange look before returning his gaze to the pack of shifters, clearly fantasizing about eviscerating a handful of forest creatures himself. They finished cleaning in silence. Then a raucous cry echoed up from the bar. A line had formed in the brief time she'd been away, and those waiting were already growing restless.
I thought I told you to pour the whiskey,
Talbot said irritably, using a chair as leverage to push to his feet.
More than 12 at the bar isn't a line, it's a problem.
She stood up as well, waving the soiled cloth she'd used on the ale. You also told me to help you clean. I only have 2 hands.
Well, that's not very practical,
he interrupted, giving her a shove towards the counter.
Go deal with that. I'll finish up over here. Someone needs to teach those wolves a lesson in manners.
Most days, she would have delighted in watching him do exactly that. But the floorboards were literally trembling beneath the horde of impatient feet, so she hurried back to the bar. All right, gentlemen. She wove her way through the crowd, slipping again behind the counter. What can I get for everyone?" A chorus of voices rang out in reply, most of them demanding the same thing, with a few notable exceptions. There was a clattering of glass and a clinking of bottles as she poured with both hands, flashing a quick look at the huntsman who'd asked for a glass of herbal tea. "That will take a moment longer," she warned, tucking back strands of messy hair as the bulk of the crowd drifted back across the room. "I'll need to put the kettle on." He inclined his head as a trio of rowdy shifters escaped Talbot's sanctimonious lecture on property damage and pushed their way back to the bar. They were younger than the rest, new to the pack and bursting with adrenaline. The flood of whiskey coursing through their veins didn't help.
"Just telling you what I saw."
One of them swayed unsteadily before collapsing on a stool behind the counter. "The man looks just as we do.
Prettier, perhaps, but he was definitely a fae. He had the pointed ears and the brow and everything.
Didn't speak to us, just got on his horse and left."
"That's nothing," another slurred, sitting beside him. "I saw a vampire once." His companions laughed uproariously. "You did not." "I most certainly did," the man insisted fiercely, looking between them. "He was coming out of a tavern just like this one, near Gout. Do you doubt my word, Luther?"
His friend missed all those warning signs, surveying him with a wicked grin.
"If you'd actually seen a vampire, there's no way you'd be sitting with us today. We'd be here drinking, toasting your memory, while your body floated peacefully downstream."
The shifter pushed abruptly to his feet, toppling the chair behind him. His friends were quick to follow, but a second before anyone could speak, Kiera slid casually in between them.
"Maybe he did see a vampire," she ventured,
turning the chair upright and easing a fresh drink into their clenched hands.
"Maybe we're speaking to his ghost."
There was a moment of precarious silence, then the shifters burst out laughing. Thank the gods. It was a fundamental rule she had broken. If one didn't have abilities beyond what was natural, one mustn't insert themselves into the quarrels of those who did. It didn't help that she was a woman, or that she scarcely outbalanced the weight of their combined cloaks. But the fates must have been smiling that night, and Talbot couldn't handle another broken glass. The wolves were still laughing as she slipped around the counter, toasting her cleverness before vanishing into the crowd. She stared after them a moment, then remembered the kettle. Herbal tea. Like I said, quite the woman. She glanced up in surprise to see Charles still perched upon a stool near the end of the bar, watching the commotion and slowly nursing the rest of his drink. When their eyes met, he raised the glass in a playful salute. "Simple pragmatism," she replied. "Spend 4 years working in a room dominated by drunken men, you learn the best way to navigate these kinds of situations is through humor and copious amounts of alcohol." "You seem well up to the task," he admitted, flashing a quick glance at a shifter who reached covertly across the counter, fishing a bottle from the shelves. "But I wonder if you enjoy it." "If I enjoy it?" Kiera echoed back, laughing aloud at the idea as she slapped the errant wolf on the hand. "Where do you come from, sir? For I must one day travel there myself." His eyes twinkled as he surveyed her across the bar. "No time like the present. I'm leaving at daybreak for the western shore. There are grand ships there, I've heard. Ships that travel to lands yet unseen. I would like to sail upon one of these myself." He paused a moment, weighing his next words. "I would like you to come with me." She nodded along with a smile, wiping up the counter. "Ah, I see." A ringing silence fell between them, and the smile faded as she lifted her gaze. Amidst the drunken pandemonium around them, the man was sitting in perfect stillness, staring as though they were the only two people left in the world. The commotion itself seemed to retreat from the edges of him, fading into the periphery, driven back by that unnatural calm. "You jest," she said flatly. "You wish me to come with you to the eastern shore, The western shore, he corrected with a smile, though any shoreline will do. A pair of voices summoned her from the opposite side of the bar, but she remained where she was standing, locked in the hypnotic gaze of those twinkling eyes. You are mad, she tried to smile, seeking refuge in the script, but found the skill beyond her reach. We met each other only a few moments ago, and now you want me to travel alongside you to the western shore, so the two of us can board a ship together and sail into the unknown. He nodded slowly, fingers tracing the rim of his drink. I suspect we'll kiss at some point along the way, but that's the long and short of it. She let out a breath of laughter, blushing in spite of herself. You are mad, she repeated gently, trying to ease him into the idea. You surely realize this. I cannot have been the first person to have told you. He merely smiled, nodding again. I have heard something along those lines, always from the most satisfied of women. She laughed again in spite of herself, forgetting all those hard-learned lessons for a split second, and allowing herself to consider, allowing herself to dream. And suppose you don't like me, she teased, planting a hand on her hip. Suppose we get halfway out to sea, then you decide there's a girl you might have liked better. He rubbed at the stubble on his chin with a serious expression. You're right, I hadn't thought of that. He considered a second longer, then glanced up as the answer presented itself. I suppose we should test that part out right away, just to make sure we're both compatible. It's not the way I would have preferred, it's just simple pragmatism. I'm sure you'll understand. This time she laughed in earnest, finding herself back on familiar ground. Yes, of course. Makes sense. The voices called out again, and she hurried to fill their order, tossing an empty bottle into the bin, only to find the man sitting in the exact same position as before. He watched as she went about her duties, pouring drinks and dishing out soup, but never moved a single inch on the chair. It was not all a jest, he said abruptly, staring with a peculiar expression. Well, I would very much like to kiss you. I have no expectations of such a thing. But the offer is real. He stared a moment longer, then cocked his head with a smile. Would you come away with me? Pick a spot on the map and leave this place behind. Her lips parted uncertainly, as the question hung between them, hovering like a life raft amidst all that churning chaos of the crowd. She pulled in a breath to answer, completely unsure as to what she might say, when Talbot's voice rang out across the tavern. Kiera, we need more water. There's a pail hanging out back. Her eyes flew across the tavern to see him kneeling beside the fire, poking at something in the cauldron with a pointed metal stick. By the time she glanced back, Charles had laid some coins upon the counter and was picking up a bottle, a mischievous smile playing about his lips. Hurry back, he said with a wink. Adventure awaits. Kiera grabbed the bucket off the nail and hurried out into the night, heading towards the nearby stream with it banging against her leg every other step. She had received such propositions many times before. She had bantered with men across the counter many times before, but never had it struck her quite the same way. There was something alarmingly genuine about Charles, the way he spoke, the words he chose, the way he smiled. Talbot was right. He had soft, unused hands. That was real gold he'd set down upon the counter. There was a chance he wasn't just drunk, and he wasn't just crazy. There was a chance his offer was actually real. Does it matter? For almost 18 years, she had lived in the village. The house where she'd been born stood empty, just a stone's throw away. She knew every inch of it, had climbed every tree in the surrounding forest, but in those rare, quiet moments, she always found herself gazing the other way. It was an addiction, her mother used to say. She was addicted to the horizon. Aching dreams turned into restless fantasies. Those fantasies grew strong enough to consume, catching her in the fleeting moments of distraction, turning her eyes to the clouds. It wasn't a lack of contentment. A thick skin was needed to survive life in such a tiny village, and she was grateful for everything she already had. It was merely a compulsion, a nameless stirring that had guided her feet and shaped every thought, just as much as her childhood teachers. One that made it difficult to let such an offer merely slide away. Perhaps it does matter, and perhaps he speaks in earnest. She knelt at the side of the stream, letting the icy water fill the bucket to the brim. Perhaps in a few weeks' time we could be stepping aboard a ship. For a moment, the idea was so ridiculous that she laughed aloud, quieting herself quickly and glancing around the surrounding woods. But the smile lingered even after she pushed to her feet, playing around the corners of her lips as she started walking back to the village. Could you imagine? The western shore. And that's when it happened. There was a sound like a hurricane as the air around her suddenly shifted, lifting her hair skywards before flattening her suddenly into the ground. She let out a silent yelp, peeling her face from the pine needles, only to scream in earnest as a wave of fire poured out of the sky. The heat of it was incredible. Even so far away, it scorched through her, singeing the edges of her dress and blistering the skin on the backs of her hands. Her body curled of its own accord as her arms flew protectively over her head. But even then, it only took a second to realize she wasn't the only one screaming. No! She lifted her eyes again, tear-stained and bleary, to see the distant rooftop of the tavern vanish in the blaze of that impossible fire. The screams that had managed to pierce the forest were immediately silenced as the entire village was devoured in a raging inferno, burning alive for a single horrifying instant before disappearing without a single trace. No. A tremor shook through her body. She rose halfway to her knees, then convulsed at the waist and promptly threw up. By the time she straightened, the smoke had overtaken her. She retched again, gasping for air, then stumbled instinctively to her feet and raced in the opposite direction, towards the clearer air. There was no longer any sense of direction. It was impossible to see farther than her own hands. At many points, she tripped and fell over. Even then, she kept moving, dragging herself frantically across the ground. It wasn't until she reached the edge of the suffocating cloud that she saw it, squinting up through the swirling clouds of smoke. It was only an instant, only a vague outline, one that would be challenged many times in the days to come, one that she could never forget. That can't be a dragon. Then she blacked out. Chapter 2. When Kiera's eyes fluttered open several hours later, the heat from the fire had vanished, and the air around her felt abruptly cold. She shivered the second she was conscious, wrapping her arms around her chest before slowly picking herself up off the ground. There were a few blissful seconds when she told herself that it couldn't have happened. Her mind was playing tricks on her. She'd made the whole thing up. Unwilling to turn around and look, she stayed in those seconds as long as she physically could. Then her eyes drifted down to her dress. It was black in some parts, gone in others. An entire sleeve had vanished, while the hem of the rose-coloured skirt was drenched in soot and frayed to the knees. Then there were her hands. She lifted them slowly in front of her face, staring in cold astonishment at the raw and blistered skin. She'd been so far away when it happened. How could they possibly? She turned all at once, not just looking, but running back towards the village as fast as her legs could carry her. In the delirium following the blaze, she hadn't scrambled away nearly as far as her dizzied mind had led her to believe. She was only a short way from the stream where she'd stopped to fill the bucket. The village would come into sight only a little ways after. By some random compulsion, she picked up the bucket. One of the only things to have remained perfectly upright without a single drop spilled. Half of it splashed across her bare legs as she carried it along with her, swinging it wildly by her side as she... In the space of a single heartbeat, she froze where she stood. Except, I won't see the village, because the village isn't there. Because the fire wasn't random, it was an attack, and it came from a... She stopped herself cold, unable to think the word. Like a frightened child, her gaze travelled onward through the trees, but her feet refused to move any farther. She stood there instead, shuffling nervously, casting petrified glances towards the sky. Then, all at once, she started walking in the opposite direction. "Help!" She breathed the word aloud, angling out of the smoking forest and towards the narrow road. "That's what I need, to find some help." It was that prospect alone that kept her going. The desperate desire to lay that terrible word at someone else's feet that kept her from fainting once again and freezing outside in the woods. Of course, it wasn't until she'd stumbled a few miles farther that she realized the other, rather obvious side to her task. It wasn't just to tell people about what happened. She needed to warn them as well. "A dragon!" She forced herself to say the word, casting another terrified look at the sky as she did. "That's what I saw. A dragon." Except it was a dragon like no other. A dragon that even her childhood books and travellers' fables had never brought to life. There was such a thing as dragons. This much was fact. And while they were said to have lived far away and died out long ago, the general picture of them was clear. A giant, fire-breathing lizard with wings. There was little reason to describe them further, because that much alone was sure to kill you. The talons, the fangs, the fact that they were said to have tracked their prey for hundreds of miles, none of that mattered. A dragon was a dragon, and whether or not they were truly extinct, they were recognizable to everyone in the known world. This one was different. This one had 3 heads. 3 heads? For the second time that day, her feet abruptly stopped walking. The rest of her continued obliviously forward, falling onto her elbows in a pile of shriveled leaves. How is that possible? She trembled with belated terror, remembering that suspended moment when she'd looked up at the sky. It had been nearly impossible to see anything through the smoke. Even when she was directly beneath the creature, all she'd been able to glimpse was a slice of wings, the flicker of fire. But when it had turned towards the ground, the smoke had cleared and she'd seen with perfect clarity the 3 writhing necks, the 6 pairs of yellow eyes glaring down upon her village. A sob caught in her throat, blurring her sight with tears. "Talbot, Marcel, my friends, the school mistress." Even the pack of shifters, there only by coincidence, had met the same terrible fate. Every person she'd ever known, every place she'd ever gone, vanished in a single instant. Except it wasn't an instant, she thought bitterly, feeling a warm spark of anger for the first time. They had enough time to feel it. They had enough time to scream. A kind of hatred the likes of which she'd never known swept down upon her, lifting her with a strange grace back to her feet. The road was freezing, and the night had only just begun, but that fatigue had inexplicably lifted, and there was nothing but hard determination in her eyes. "I'm going to tell the world what happened here, and we're going to tear that dragon straight out of the sky." If she'd had the sense to think about those next few steps, she might have thought the first task to be a challenge, and the second to be borderline impossible. If she'd paused a moment to take a breath, she might have considered things further, come up with something resembling a plan. But with that tear-stained vengeance propelling her forward, she could do nothing but march down the centre of the road, vowing not to stop until she found someone willing to listen. It would be the start of a very long night. It was almost dawn by the time she saw the first wagon, the first of what turned out to be a caravan of 4 or 5 more. They were farmers by the looks of them, the kind of people who trained themselves to rise an hour before the sun in order to bring to the market the freshest crops. Kiera stared for a long moment, dead on her feet, trying to convince herself the caravan was real. Then she took off running towards them, calling out in desperation and waving her arms. In hindsight, not the best first impression.
"Help me!"
she shrieked, clutching at her tattered dress when it began to fall.
"Someone, please, you have to help me! I'm from the village of Cattling. There's been an attack!"
It was only because she said the name of the place that anyone paused to listen to the rest of it. Even then, 2 of the wagons veered towards the edge of the road to avoid her. Even in the larger villages, bound by some degree of community, life was such that people didn't take chances. One didn't side with the victim. One simply learned to avoid those who had become too strong.
"Please help me!"
she cried again, making an effort to lower her voice.
"The village has been burned to the ground. There is nothing left."
This caught some attention. An older man riding up front pulled on the reins to his donkey, bringing his cart to a gradual stop. The 2 behind him followed suit, craning their necks to hear what was being said.
"You are speaking of Cattling,"
he repeated, looking her up and down with weathered eyes.
"The village between the crest of the woods and the Ireforth River?"
She had never known the river had been named. By the time it had wound its way to the forest beside her home, it had narrowed to nothing more than a stream.
"I have just come from there," she answered quickly, nodding at top speed. "The entire place has been destroyed, burned to cinders and ash."
The man stared a moment before glancing back at his cart.
"We were just heading in that direction,"
he murmured, almost to himself,
"to bring some harvest to a pack of shifters staying in the town. I just received a raven."
"The shifters are dead," she interrupted, glancing at another wagon that had stopped to listen in the middle of the road.
"They are all dead."
Her voice choked up, catching on the word, but she forced herself forward.
"Please, you must help me. We need to spread the word."
A series of uneasy looks passed between those riding atop the wagons. A pair of children ventured curiously from the one in the back, but their nervous mother hurried them back inside.
"You say there was an attack?"
She turned her gaze to another man standing beside the horses. There was a grim set to his mouth, and he spoke the words sternly, like there was a chance she was making the story up.
"But it's done already,"
another murmured, not meeting her eyes.
"There's nothing left."
If she hadn't looked so tragic, there was a chance he wouldn't have even averted his gaze. As it stood, he merely climbed back onto his mare, tugging the reins to turn the creature's shaggy head.
"No, wait!"
"Answer me, girl!" The stern man raised his voice to summon her attention, speaking for the rest of the group.
"The village was burned to the ground. Who was it that attacked you?"
She pulled in a quick breath, approaching the tenuous part of her story. While the villagers themselves had close ties, that sense of community didn't generally extend to include each other. The roads weren't safe, and travel was generally limited. The man was asking only from a sense of self-preservation, to keep the threat from spreading from one place to the next. If it was a reasonably matched opponent, perhaps something might be done.
"This is not a reasonably matched opponent. It wasn't a group of people,"
she began uncertainly, angling her hands so they might see the blisters and blood.
"It was a creature."
The road sighed, stilled with an expectant pause, and she let out a quiet sigh, knowing she would have to say the rest.
"It was a dragon."
For a split second, nothing happened. Then there was a wooden creak as the carts began to move on.
"Wait, I'm not lying,"
she called, watching in dismay as they rolled past her. Those riding along either glared openly or avoided her eyes.
"It was a dragon, I swear it! A massive dragon flying over the forest, raining fire down from the sky."
Most of the wagons had turned around to return home, apparently deciding that while the girl was clearly traumatized and raving, the village had most likely been destroyed. In the days to come, they would no doubt speculate as to what had done it. Perhaps a band of mercenaries or a plague, or perhaps a fire gone out of control. She was covered in burns after all. A pair of them even continued moving forward, as if she was merely some lunatic roaming the side of the road, and the village would be there just as it always was. She watched them roll away in silence, already knowing what they would find.
"I swear it,"
she whispered after them, tears sliding down her cheeks.
"It was a dragon."
For the next hour, she continued shuffling down the road, feeling the hurts she'd sustained sharpen into painful clarity, scuffing her boots against the deep grooves worn into the dirt. The vengeful rage that was driving her had long since subsided, and she was left feeling suddenly adrift, considering problems that had been lost in the initial shock.
"I have no food or water. I have no money or relations. I have no clothes when this dress falls to pieces. I have no home."
The walk itself became somewhat ironic. There was nothing left behind her, but there was no greater certainty of anything that lay up ahead. The world had narrowed to the journey itself, and she was near the point of defeat.
"Damn it,"
she cursed under her breath, kneeling down to massage the bruised ankle. What she wouldn't give for a cloth and some warm water. In the mother of all ironies, what she wouldn't give for a cup of herbal tea. More than anything, she wanted desperately to sleep, but the forest was full of predators that could tear her to pieces, and the road itself was little better. Between the bandits, mercenaries, and dark whims of fellow travelers, there wasn't a single person in her village who hadn't encountered some kind of trouble at some point in their lives. Except for Talbot. But the man's an ox. Who in their right mind would consider... She froze where she stood, tears pouring down her face. How could they just be gone? No longer there from one moment to the next. How could it all be so sudden, so fragile? It felt like a story that happened to someone else, one she would think about with a pang of sympathy, tucked under the blankets of her bed. How could the story be hers? For a moment, she thought of the man she'd met right before it all happened, his handsome face lit with the thrill of adventure, that mischievous twinkle dancing in his eyes. For whatever reason, it was the image of his face that stayed with her, as the ground gave out beneath her, and she collapsed in the center of the road. What could have been minutes or hours, she simply lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness, eyes fluttering open and shut. The last thing she remembered was a pair of boots walking slowly towards her, each step clouding the air with dust. They came to a stop just inches away as a distant voice echoed above. "Now what do we have here?" She pulled in a breath to answer, then let out a sneeze. Then the world faded to black. Chapter 3. Kiera woke up to the smell of burnt carrots.
This must be a dream.
Her eyes fluttered open slowly, trying to focus as they drifted around the shadows. It was night, that much was certain, and she appeared to be indoors. But indoors was a relative term, given that she could scarcely see past the flickering light of a fire, and for the life of her, she couldn't imagine what had... "Where the heck are my clothes?" She let out a gasp, clutching at the fabric that had slipped to her waist the moment she tried to push to her feet. Her body crumpled a moment later, curving in on itself as she scrambled to pull the blanket back over her skin. Not a blanket, she realized suddenly. It was a cloak. Her gaze rose once more, travelling from the stone beneath her fingers to the curved walls and domed roof made of exactly the same uneven grey. A breath caught in her chest. A silent scream. I'm naked. In a cave. Living every young woman's worst nightmare. The sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere outside. Just a soft crunch of leaves. But her eyes widened in terror. Without stopping to think, she grabbed a log from the fire and raced towards the entrance, hiding herself as best she could behind a curve in the rock. Not exactly the most discreet weapon, given that it was currently on fire, but she'd be left with few options. She froze perfectly still as footsteps got closer, raising it above her head. And when the figure of a man stepped inside... Hey! He ducked with a shout and caught the log with a single hand, staring in astonishment at the wild-eyed girl who just swung it towards his head with her full might. For a moment, it looked as though he might want to talk about that a bit, but he was unable to get past the surprise. You're awake. He glanced down at the satchel of herbs that had fallen to the floor when she attacked. I was just trying to... Get away from me! She took off running a second later, shoving him for good measure as she sprinted clumsily towards the trees. The heavy fabric tanged around her legs, but she managed to keep going. Her body was shaking, just barely managing to stay on her feet. It was only then she was forced to acknowledge that it was the middle of the night, and she had no earthly idea where she was going. She also wasn't wearing any shoes. She threw a fleeting glance over her shoulder, only to see that he hadn't followed her. He was merely standing by the entrance of the cave, watching as she hurried away. A sense of hesitation came over her, chipping away at that panicked momentum. That's when she saw he was shivering. The cloak she was wearing was his own. Please don't make me regret this. What is this place? She called from afar, stopping within the line of the trees and staring back like a frightened animal. What am I doing here? He answered slowly, keeping both hands in sight. You're in the woods, not far from the village of Kapua. I was heading to meet a group of fishermen camped alongside the river and found you lying in the middle of the road. There was nothing for miles, no trace of where you'd come from, so I carried you here. He paused then, letting her interpret that information however she wished. She considered a moment, then decided to be skeptical. You undressed me, she accused, levelling a finger at his chest. I didn't, he responded quickly. Your clothes were in bad shape. They fell apart when I lifted you from the road. But you have been covered every moment since, you have my word. Given the present circumstances, it seemed the most trivial of matters, but she found herself reassured all the same. That's when she noticed the bandages on her hands. What? Those were in bad shape too. He lowered his voice, remembering the blood. Burned from the look of it. He gestured to the fallen herbs at his feet. I was trying to make you a balm. He trailed into silence, and for a moment the two of them just stood there. While she might have slept through the beginning of their introduction, the next few steps would be hers. She glanced over her shoulder to the forest before tentatively meeting his eyes. It's very cold. He tilted his head with the trace of a smile. It's warmer by the fire. Only moments later, the pair was sitting in front of the dancing flames, knees folded beneath them, watching in absolute silence as he rubbed the herbal salve into the raw skin on her hands. It was tedious work, though not as painful as it might have been. The one thing it gave her was time. Clear, uninterrupted time in which she might study him in secret. He was young, probably only a year or two older than she was, with hair the colour of dark chestnuts and eyes of a startling green. His head was often tilted downwards, focused on his work, but the glimpses she saw carried a particular kind of beauty. There was a gracefulness to him that tempered the edges of that inherent strength, and his body, while lean and muscled, attended to hers with a surprising amount of care. one that made her suddenly wonder if he had any children. "My mother taught me this when I was young," he murmured, winding the strips of cloth in a tight circle around her palm. "I'm afraid I'm not very good." Whether or not he possessed the skill, the sting in her hands immediately lessened. She lifted them with a touch of surprise, turning them back and forth as she flexed her fingers. He watched in silence, brow furrowing with a thoughtful frown. "Those are some serious burns. Were you cooking or something?"
Was I cooking?
For a split second, she merely stared at him. Then her entire body deflated, wilting like a knife ripped through the sail of a ship. A pair of tears slipped unbidden down her cheeks, and all of the adrenaline that had carried her thus far seemed to vanish like smoke in a breeze. He watched the silent progression with a hint of alarm. "We don't need to discuss it. My village burned to the ground," she answered roughly, keeping her eyes trained on the stone between them. "That's why I was in the road. There isn't anything left." He stared a moment, then his eyes drifted to the flaming logs. "Did you see what happened?" There was a chance he was going to ask, "Was it you?" She'd attacked him with fire. She was the only one who'd apparently survived the blaze, but he said nothing of the sort. He simply waited. She hesitated a few seconds, then returned her gaze to the ground. "No, I didn't see what happened." They spoke no more of it that evening. They ate a disgusting soup instead. It tasted like the bottom of the pot he'd used to cook, but she was ravenous and hardly bothered to taste each spoonful before gulping it down. He let her eat her fill, chewing slowly on a slice of apple and silently refilling her bowl whenever it grew close to empty. This probably should have made more of an impact. Unless one farmed it themselves, food was always scarce, and this man was travelling out on his own. But she hadn't the sense to consider such things. The world had narrowed to a single bowl, and the rest of her wasn't in the best shape. "I'm going to clean this off," he said lightly when she was finished. With deft fingers, he lifted the cauldron from a spoke beside the fire. "There's a stream nearby. I shouldn't be long." She glanced up automatically, prepared to go with him. "Let me help you." But the moment she tried to push off the ground, her arms buckled, and she fell right back down where they'd been sitting. The cloak pulled free of the knot where she tied it, rippling down to her waist. But before she could pull in the breath to gasp, he'd caught the hem with gentle hands. "It's all right," he murmured, looking away while she tied it back again. "Just get some rest." "I don't understand," she answered shakily, holding both slender arms in front of her. "I wasn't even there when it happened. I wasn't—" Her voice choked with a sob. "I wasn't even hurt." His eyes flashed to her face, stilling with a peculiar expression. "It's a kind of shock," he said quietly. "It will pass in time." They shared a fleeting look, one that spoke to troubles and stories that should never have happened to people so young. Then she drew in a breath, and her gaze drifted again to the shadows. "Have you checked for bears?" For the first time, his face lightened with the hint of a smile. "I'm sorry?" She blushed, but repeated the question. "You decided to make camp in the middle of a woodland cave. We're going to be sleeping in here. Did you at least check to make sure it wasn't occupied first?" He opened his lips to reply, then bowed his head with a grin. "Yes, I checked." Doubtful, but she decided to believe him. Without another word, he pushed to his feet, slipping the bowls into the pot and carrying it along with him. He was almost to the door of the cave when she called out once again. "I don't even know your name." He hesitated, then glanced over his shoulder. "I don't know yours." She stared back at him in surprise, caught off guard by the sudden edge to his tone. Never in all her years had someone simply not answered the question, and she'd worked at a tavern. "I'm Kiera," There was a beat of silence. Jessie. Their eyes met again, and she managed a tiny smile. Thank you for everything you've done. He held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded curtly, vanishing out the entrance. Get some rest. The stream might have been nearby, but Jessie didn't return for a long while. Such a long while that Kiera actually considered going out to look for him before the fatigue took over, and she fell into a deep and dreamless sleep. By the time she awoke, he was sleeping beside her. Not close beside her, on the other side of the deceased fire. He's going to freeze. With as much dignity as possible, she scooted around on the floor until she was lying beside him. Part of the cloak was wrapped securely around her body, while she tucked the other half over his chest with such gentle hands there was no way such a thing could possibly disturb his sleep. His eyes flew open. What are you doing? What's wrong? The questions strung together, fast as arrows racing to find their mark. She jumped in her skin, and her cheeks flamed in reply as she leaned back as far as the shared cloak would allow. It isn't fair that you have only a shirt to warm you, she stammered self-consciously. I could see your breath from across the room. You'll catch your death of cold. He blinked a moment in surprise, then glanced at the pale sunrise. It's morning anyway. In a single lithe movement, he extracted himself swiftly from the cloak, casting her a quick look as he stood. But thank you. That was very sweet. She stared up at him, then pushed to her feet as well. You were the one who gave up your cloak, she answered with a tight smile, suddenly wishing she'd stayed on her side of the cave. Which I'll be giving back to you, by the way. I just need to find something else to... She trailed off, having no idea how to finish the sentence. Everything she had was back in Cateling. Every single possession she'd collected over the course of her life. Her books, her clothes, her brush. In hindsight, she probably should have gone back to the village after all, scoured through the ashes for anything that might be of use. I could have buried my friends as well, instead of leaving them for the birds. That's all right. Jessie dipped his head a little to catch her gaze, surprising her with a friendly smile. It's just a cloak. I can find another one when we get you some shoes. Her eyes watered with involuntary tears at his use of the word we. It was more than she could have hoped for, far beyond what a stranger might have hoped to receive. But a sudden pang of guilt tightened her chest. Jessie, wait. She caught his arm as he knelt to rekindle the fire, avoiding his eyes when he straightened once more. Before we go any further, there's something I need to tell you. When you asked me before if I'd seen what burned down the village, I lied to you. I saw it from the trees. She pulled in a breath, already bracing for the fallout. It was a dragon. Total, absolute silence. I'm so sorry, she whispered, pulse quickening in fear. I should have told you last night. I should have told you the moment I opened my eyes, but none of the people in the wagons would listen, and I didn't want you to throw me out into the woods. A dragon, he repeated, with an indecipherable expression. Like the dragons we used to read about in stories? That's the thing you saw. She nodded miserably. This is probably where you take back your cloak. He stared down at her a few seconds, then lifted his gaze to the sky. I can see why you'd keep that to yourself. Chapter 4. What does that mean? Kiera raced across the clearing towards the forest, trying to keep up with her newfound saviour's lengthy strides. He departed without another word after the strange exchange following her revelation. Just a quick smile, something about gathering kindling for the fire. Then he was gone. Jessie, she called again, hurrying after him. What does that mean? He threw a glance over his shoulder. Which part confuses you? With a surge of boldness, she caught hold of his sleeve, slowing him down long enough to circle into his path. The whole part. She stared up at him, trying to measure his response. How are you being so casual? Do you simply not believe me? Are you trying to outwalk me? I meant exactly what I said, he interrupted calmly. A dragon would be a difficult explanation to swallow. I can see why you had so much trouble with the wagons. She released him in surprise, ill-equipped to handle such perfect candor. A few seconds passed while they merely stood there, both waiting to see what would happen next. You think I'm crazy? It wasn't a question, it was written all over his face. But no sooner had she said it than his eyes softened with a tenderness she would never quite be able to explain. It matters not whether I believe in the dragon, he said quietly. You believe in it. It is a story that has meaning to you. I was not there and could not say for sure. I am only here now to hear you speak of it. So the question for me is not the dragon, but the girl. A rather astute assessment, with a sweet kind of logic at its core. And you would stay with me? She asked hesitantly, nervous to ask the rest. Why? He stared down at her a moment, then flicked a tear from her cheeks. Why indeed? Without another word, he was off, striding with that same enigmatic confidence into the forest. She stared after him in silence, trying to reconcile the arrangement in her mind. The problem was, there wasn't an arrangement. He'd simply decided to help her. She didn't know what to make of this. It was a beautiful place, the land where she'd grown up. She loved every inch of it, revelled in each new season. But life had never been easy, and those who made it through adolescence had each of those childhood lessons etched deep into their bones. You did not get something for nothing. The world relied upon balance, and every debt incurred would need to be paid. That being said, they weren't in a tavern where she could work for food and lodging. They were in the middle of the woods, a place where he was clearly in his element, and there was likely nothing she could do to help that he wouldn't have been able to do just as easily himself. He didn't seem to desire her physically, not that she'd have been willing to exchange such a thing for protection, and her little confession about the dragon looked to have already left his mind. Maybe he's crazy. Wait for me! She ran after him without having settled upon anything, stumbling through the underbrush before reappearing breathless at his side. Surely you must have questions. He kept his eyes on the trees, thinking it over. What colour was it? She flashed him a caustic look. It was clear. There was a beat of silence. You're bluffing. He continued walking with the hint of a smile, oblivious to her increasing frustration and struggle to keep pace. A part of her was vaguely aware that she was working against her own self-interests. Another part was quite insistent that she should immediately stop. But those voices had always dimmed beneath a louder curiosity, a burning desire to find answers and understand. Does nothing shock you? She demanded, yanking free her cloak when it snagged on a curve of thistle. Or do you often come across naked girls claiming to have seen fabled beasts? More often than you might think, he said seriously, pulling aside a branch. But that's to be expected here in the low country. It's higher in the mountains I worry about. Once you get past a certain elevation, all the locals strip down and start raving about translucent bears. The two of them shared a swift look. A little joke to lighten the tension. They walked on a bit further as she searched for something to say. All the usual scripts had failed her. The conversational strategies she'd learned in the tavern. The man beside her was blunt to the point of being impervious. There was no way to crack armor that simply wasn't there. It was either the bravest or most foolish adaptation she'd ever seen. It isn't that I'm not grateful, she said quietly, flashing a quick look at his eyes. It's just, in the last few days, I've had enough surprises. I don't want to get another that I won't see coming with you. Would you please tell me, if you don't believe my story, why are you helping me?" He finally stopped walking, turning to stare with sudden intensity into her eyes. His face was hard to read in the best of moments, but this one simply left her frozen, waiting with bated breath. "Maybe I know what it's like to have a story people won't believe. Maybe I know what it's like to have that story challenged by everyone around you. Challenged even by yourself." The two of them stared at each other in silence, poised on the edge of an understanding. It wasn't the most conventional of situations. Under no circumstances could it be considered ideal. But there was something about it that she trusted all the same. Something that made her hope. "It had 3 heads, she blurted. "Honestly, what the heck is wrong with you?" He blinked slowly. "That's unfortunate." If he did think she was crazy, he wasn't saying it, at least not out loud. That was kind of him. She'd spent enough time around enough sorts of people to know it was a rare thing, that kindness. But she needed more than kindness now. She needed something extraordinary. "I need to warn the others." He stepped back abruptly, eyebrows rising in genuine surprise. "That is your intention?" he asked incredulously. "You want to travel the countryside, telling people to watch out for a dragon. What are you going to do, go to village? She nodded briskly, tightening the borrowed cloak. "If I must." "That's never going to work," he argued. "You told me yourself how well that news was received by the people in the wagons. You think it will be any better in the villages?" "Jessie," she intoned, jabbing a finger towards the sky. "That creature is out there, right now, just circling around in the sky, choosing its next victims. You know, it didn't even feed on the people of my village. It burned every man, woman, and child alive just for sport." An abrupt silence fell between them, sharper than either would have liked. "And what if they believe you?" he asked shortly. "What then? You spread the news that a bloodthirsty beast is coming to get them. How in the world do you expect them to prepare? Write their memoirs? Call for a priest? These are farmers with pitchforks. They cannot hunt a dragon." "I don't know, I haven't..." She pushed her hair back in frustration, hands curling into impotent balls of rage. "Well then, what do you suggest, if you're so good at making plans?" He could have lashed back at her. He considered instead. Several moments passed as he stared into the distance, gaze drifting above the trees into a bright and endless sky. Perhaps he was simply giving himself a moment. Perhaps he was imagining how that sky might have looked different if it was darkened with fire clouds and smoke. We should tell the Fae. It was the last thing in the world she'd expected. It was also the only thing that made a bit of sense. Like a reluctant parent or teacher, the scattered peoples of the land often sought out the Fae when a problem was deemed too difficult or the stakes were too high. It wasn't exactly as if they had jurisdiction, but they were considered an authority all the same. In a world of nomads and nameless hamlets, the Immortals had achieved what no other tribe or clan had ever managed themselves. They'd created a kingdom. For thousands of years, that kingdom had kept the world in balance, guiding the rest of them through what might have otherwise been a turbulent history, with a steady, if at times impatient hand. Their innovations trickled into even the smallest of villages. Their harvest and generosity was impersonal, but shared. Their influence had even crept into local dialects. Most people were at least awkwardly conversant in the language of the Immortals. Few actual Fae spoke the common tongue. Jessie watched her consider, arms folded across his chest. If there's anyone who might actually be able to fight a dragon, it's them. She nodded mutely, wondering how in the world that might be. Then, all at once, that curiosity gave way to a more immediate problem. one that seemed overwhelming in scope and scale. "So you're saying we must seek out the Fae?" she asked hesitantly, pausing a moment as if hoping he might contradict her. "We must find them and convince them I'm telling the truth. When I couldn't convince a passing wagon, when I couldn't convince you." His eyes twinkled, guessing at her thoughts. "There's a Fae stronghold 4 days from here. I can get you there in relative safety. Once we arrive, the convincing will be up to you." She blinked in amazement. 4 days? Just 4 days from the place she'd lived her entire life, and she never knew. "We will need to stock up on supplies," he continued briskly, squinting up at the sky before leveling his gaze to the trees. "It hasn't rained since the big storm. Some parts of the trail may still be flooded, but it would still be wise to gather extra water." "And you'll really come with me?" She caught him by the hand, staring into his eyes. "Even knowing I have no money to pay you, only a story that you don't believe?" He stared back at her for a moment, before his lips quirked with the hint of a smile. "Who says I don't believe you?" He gave her fingers a quick squeeze, then cocked his head invitingly towards the trail. "There are stranger things in this world than a dragon." For the rest of the afternoon, Jessie and Kiera did something she'd only dared to imagine in her most precious of dreams. They prepared to embark upon an adventure. She was the only one to have used that particular word. Even then, she did so only inside the sanctity of her own head. But he must have intuited as much from her fluttering fingers and the feral excitement dancing in her eyes, because it wasn't long before he started making jokes about capes and quests and secret amulets that could bring the dead back to life. She tried her best to ignore him, filling their pouches with edible roots and berries. But it wasn't long before she was in stitches, often ducking behind a tree or simply covering her face so he couldn't see her snort with laughter, resurfacing a moment later with an uncontrollable smile. The man had a razor tongue. It was something that had taken a while to notice, because he more often chose to say nothing at all. But there was a searing wit behind those sparkling eyes, one that made her wonder herself in circles as to why such a man had been living by himself in the woods. After a few hours listening to his caustic observations as he hacked a trail through the underbrush using nothing but a common blade, she resolved herself never to ask. When at last the sun began to sink in the sky, the two of them headed back to the cave, lit the fire, and began taking stock of all the things they'd collected. 4 days wasn't a very long time to travel, but the woods were unpredictable, and the storm had washed away most of the trails. "That's why the shifters were in Cataling," she said abruptly as they wound down for the night. "They were helping to clear away some of the trees that had fallen in the storm." His eyes flashed to her across the fire before he nodded to himself. "A great many people were displaced in that storm, even more by the floods. I'm surprised they came so far to help." "They were good men," she murmured. In truth, she remembered them somewhat differently, but the fire had erased all sins. They didn't deserve what happened to them. He lowered his gaze to the ground, speaking in a soft voice. "We're going to find help, Kiera. That's a promise." She nodded quickly, flashing him a tight smile as they settled down for the night on opposite sides of the fire. He'd built it larger than the day before, probably to combat the cold. Despite being well equipped to provide for himself with things scavenged in the forest, the man had very little with him in terms of other supplies. The pot he was using to cook had fallen off the back of a wagon, or so he innocently claimed, and he'd brought no other clothes but the ones on his back. The cloak had been used as a blanket. Now he didn't even have that. "Good night," he murmured, rolling onto his back. She mimicked his position, staring up at the darkened stone. "Good night." Time passed slowly as the fire crackled merrily between them, painting strange dancing shadows on the walls. Jessie was oblivious, having passed out almost the instant he'd closed his eyes. but she lay there for what felt like hours, fiddling with her fingers, bouncing her feet up on the floor. I can't believe we're leaving in the morning. I can't believe this is actually happening. Considering how long she'd been dreaming of such a moment, she found herself oddly ill-equipped to handle it now. A part of her was merely lost to grief, a grief that couldn't be processed or compartmentalized, a grief that could only be channeled into something else. For the duration of the day, that ceaseless momentum had saved her. She'd been able to move forward simply by driving too relentlessly to allow herself to glance back. But here in the stillness of the cave, with little else to distract her from the coming hours, she was unable to do anything but stare at the ceiling, thinking of everything that was soon to come. I wonder what time of day we'll arrive at the stronghold. Will everyone be gathering for the morning meal? Or will the moon have risen and they'll be heading inside to bed? And what other creatures might be there? Jessie said it was a merchant hub for more than just the Fae. And the Fae! I bet they'll appear just as they do in the stories, tall and serene, fingers forever templed below the chin. I wonder how many will come with us. An entire company of archers? Maybe more. How does one attempt to fight a dragon anyway? I suppose a good plan might be avoiding the fight in the first place. When at last she couldn't take it any longer, she made the same undignified trek she'd done the night before, crawling on her knees and elbows until she was lying again by Jessie's side. She hesitated a moment, then tapped his arm. Are you awake? Clearly not. For all his earlier attentiveness, the man was completely lost to the world, hair splayed out like a dark halo around him, lips slightly parted as he drifted further and further into sleep. She tapped him again. Jessie! He startled awake with a silent gasp, grabbing her by the wrist before releasing her just as fast. His eyes took a moment to focus, drifting down to the sudden proximity between them. I might be out of practice, but should I be picking up on signals? There was a beat. What? No! She exclaimed, scooting back for good measure. It's about the journey. He lay back down with a slight groan, fists pressed into his eyes. It's 4 days, Kiera, not really a journey. Are you excited? For what? Seriously? We're about to travel to an immortal stronghold, she whispered delightedly. We're about to meet with a company of Fae to discuss the slaying of a dragon. How are you not excited? A company of Fae, he repeated under his breath. It's like you're reading it straight out of a fairy tale. They are sure to fall short. We need to measure our expectations. Like something out of a dream, she murmured, rolling onto her stomach and absent-mindedly tracing the stone. Have you ever seen one? Kiera, please couldn't we just get some? You must have travelled around before you started haunting this cave, she reasoned, turning towards him with renewed curiosity. Surely you've seen a Fae. He let out a tired sigh, refusing to look at her. I have never seen a Fae, but from everything I've heard, I'm sure they'd be delighted to be dominating the conversation. I'm sure that's not true, she argued cheerfully. If anything, they seem almost insultingly disinterested. And surely you've thought about it. I don't want to think about it at all, he snapped. I want to be asleep. There was a moment of silence, then she nodded sympathetically. I understand, she murmured. You're nervous. She flipped onto her back, staring into the ether. I'm nervous too. He sighed again, slowly opening his eyes. I'm not nervous. I'm not excited. I'm in a freakishly neutral state. I would like so very much not to be having this conversation. She nodded absent-mindedly, chin propped up in her hand. Did you say something? As it turned out, he said nothing at all. He simply closed his eyes and banged his head repeatedly against the ground. Chapter 5. The two set out walking the next morning a little before dawn. when the last twinkling stars were still fading into a pale lavender sky. They had very little to take with them, just a few water skins, a smattering of cooking paraphernalia, and the bags Kiera had filled earlier with berries and roots. She had no idea where they stood in terms of money. She was guessing it wasn't much. Where a person's coin pouch usually hung on their belt, Jessie had strung a well-used blade instead. It was an observation she decided to keep to herself. As often as possible, they kept to the main road. There was no shortage of dangers that could befall one in the forest, from a washed-out trail to the jaws of a bear. But her newfound companion seemed equally wary of travelling along a frequented path. No fewer than a dozen times as they were walking, he'd suddenly tilt his head, listen for a moment, then pull her without warning into the cover of the trees. When the trees were sparse and confrontation couldn't be avoided, he would turn his face instinctively from curious eyes, hiding behind a curtain of dark hair. He never offered an explanation. She never asked. Nor did she ask about the blade, or the scars clouding the backs of his hands, or the way he always seemed to hear those wagons coming a full minute before she could hear them herself. It was a delicate balance, but it couldn't hope to last. Before they'd gone more than a few hours, the road narrowed abruptly into a series of forest paths, each curving off in slightly a different direction, some already massacred by the recent storm. Jessie stared at them only a moment, eyes drifting out of focus, as if he was remembering the face of a map. Then he set out walking with sudden determination to the east. She followed after him, staring in silence at the back of his head. Discounting sudden moments of humour or logistics, the two hadn't really spoken since forging their inexplicable alliance the day before. It wasn't that it was unfriendly. While the silence had been long, it wasn't tense or uncomfortable. They simply couldn't think of anything to say. So, remember that time I told you about a dragon? So, remember that time you found me naked in the middle of the road? Perhaps it was better to stay quiet. Only an hour or two later, the forest grew a bit darker and a bit colder. Her breath clouded into mist between them as she followed along with the utmost care, placing her bare feet in each of his tracks. It was better than forging her own path, she had learned quite quickly. While she had only to walk in his shadow, he was clearing every step with a harsh swing of his blade. I wonder where we'll sleep tonight, she thought suddenly, glancing at the slanting rays of afternoon sunlight filtering through the trees. We don't have a tent, and won't likely stumble into another cave. How are your feet? She glanced up suddenly, looking at him in surprise. If he hadn't spoken before stopping, there was a chance she might have walked straight into him. It was the first time he'd slowed his stride in hours. Her legs were aching just trying to keep up. My what? Your feet, he repeated, glancing down to check for himself. It's a hard thing to walk for so long without shoes in the forest. I don't want you losing any toes. In truth, she'd completely forgotten. For the first few miles, the pain had been excruciating, but by now they'd gotten so cold marching across the frozen dirt that they ceased to have any feeling. Can you bend them? He prompted. She tried and failed, then flashed a cheerful smile. Yep, everything's fine. Onwards and upwards. Kiera, stop looking at my feet. He looked at her face instead, measuring the defiant expression before turning back to the trail, with a touch of amusement. Whatever you say. A few more miles passed, and they spoke of it no further. She was just starting to think the risk had passed, and he'd completely forgotten, when he abruptly deviated from the trail, weaving through a thick patch of redwoods before tossing his pack carelessly upon the ground. She paused in confusion behind him, standing on the edge of the path. I'm cold, he declared without further explanation. Her lips pursed to hide a smile. Sure. That's rather feeble, she answered with a shiver, joining him amidst the trees. He was pacing now, assembling the makings of a fire. Not to embarrass you, "There's no shame in the truth," he replied briskly, taking his collection and kneeling in the center of the clearing. "It's something I'm known for being rather feeble." She bit her lip with a grin, perching lightly upon his pack. Since she'd learned to walk, she'd been making fires herself, but each of them had been in the pit of an indoor hearth, and she found herself fascinated by the skill. She watched closely as he arranged the twigs and dried bits of brush with deft fingers before adding larger pieces of wood, checking each one for moss or the kind of rot that was sure to smoke. When it was finished, he struck a piece of rock, then cupped his hands around the pile, breathing it to life. "You're pretty good at that," she murmured. He continued working, face half hidden by a veil of dark hair. "I'm sure you've made hundreds yourself." "Never outside," she replied softly. "Only in the tavern. I've actually—" Her cheeks flamed with a sudden blush. "I've actually never been more than a few miles from my village." He glanced up in surprise, studying her in the flickering light. It was an unnerving assessment, however brief, one that deepened that incriminating blush and made her wish she'd kept quiet. But after only a few seconds, he abruptly waved her forward. "Time to learn." Without another word, he knocked the whole thing down with a swipe of his hand and patted out the lingering flames. Once they were safely extinguished, he motioned for her to kneel on the ground beside him, pointing to each clump of smouldering debris in turn. "Start with that. Make sure it's dry." For the next 20 minutes, they went through the process from beginning to end, talking through each step as she slowly constructed a fire of her own. When it was complete, he knocked it down as well, and took her into the trees to forage for new pieces, drawing her attention to the smallest of details, showing her the places to look and the things to avoid. When they returned to the camp, she worked with new confidence, leaning back on her heels as the flames burst into life. "Did you see that?" She raised her eyes with a beaming smile, only to see the same expression mirrored on his face. He caught himself quickly, kneeling beside her and motioning to her feet. "Let's see them." With a martyred sigh, she stretched her legs towards the fire, alarmed to realize they were no longer responding with any degree of coordination or strength. Her stomach tightened with a jolt of fear, and she hitched herself up higher to look. He was already kneeling on the ground in front of her, wrapping his fingers gently around her ankles and hoisting both feet into his lap. "Does it hurt?" he asked softly. She shook her head quickly, too anxious to feel any sense of shame. Her skin was streaked with mud and smears of dried blood, but he didn't seem to notice. He simply lifted each foot for a delicate examination, nodding to himself as he pressed them experimentally against his palms. "I've seen this before," he murmured, setting them back on his legs. "It will get a little worse before it gets better, but the sensation will return. We just need to get you heated up." Without another word, he began unlacing the top of his shirt, angling his body between her and the fire. She nodded along, then froze dead still, suddenly unable to take a breath. "What are you doing?" "The fire itself is too strong," he explained softly, fingers loosening the threads. "It will just heat things up while your skin recovers. You need something warm, but not hot." Before she had time to process, he opened his shirt and took her by the ankles, pressing the bottoms of both feet to the bare skin on his chest. She jerked back reflexively, gasping in surprise. "Wait." "Trust me," he said calmly. "This works." They locked eyes for a suspended moment, then she eased back into his hands. He flinched only once against the cold, then offered a steady smile, kneeling with perfect balance in front of her and staring intently into her eyes. At first, nothing happened. She merely sat there, cheeks flaming, feeling like she wanted to bury her head in the ground. Then, slowly, she began to feel the heat radiating through him. Slowly, parts of her body began to tingle back to life. Ow! She jerked again as a flash of pain shot up her body, landing somewhere in her teeth. Instead of smooth skin, it felt as though the bottoms of her feet were resting on heated knives. He grimaced sympathetically, but didn't relax his grip. "It stings at first. I'm sorry." She nodded curtly, not trusting herself to do more. For a few minutes they merely sat there, long enough for the burn to subside, long enough for her to wonder again at this bare-chested stranger, the one cradling her mud-stained feet. "I didn't think they were this far gone," she admitted, pushing her hair back with a self-conscious blush. "I thought they were just numb from walking." He nodded faintly, fingers still wrapped around her ankles. "There was a lot of this back when I was growing up. Children would take off their shoes without telling anyone. By the time you tracked them down, they were smiling, but their toes were about to fall off." He laughed softly, shifting a little beneath her. "Most people try rubbing them or holding them directly to a flame. That's a mistake. It breaks the skin." She smiled without knowing the reason, tilting her head to catch his eye. "Speaking from experience?" His face stilled before he flashed a quick grin. "Not me, but my little brother. There was this..." A sudden noise echoed through the forest, the sound of distant voices and a wooden creak that could only be the turning of the wheels on a cart. They quieted in unison, staring towards the road like a pair of rigid statues. They were far enough into the trees that no one would have been able to see them, but there was no disguising the telltale spiral of campfire smoke. "Hello there!" A man stepped out of the brush, raising his hand in a wave. A group of shy-looking people ventured behind him, staring wistfully towards the flames. "Mind if we join you?" Kiera's eyes went automatically to Jesse, who froze on the spot. "Shit," he cursed under his breath, watching as they approached. "We should have gone further inside. I didn't think we'd be lighting so many fires." "It's just a family," she chided softly, waving them forward in return. "They're traveling just as we are. What's the worst that could happen?" He gave her a look as though she'd said something very stupid, then pushed swiftly to his feet as the group stepped into the clearing. In hindsight, it must have been a rather strange sight. She was sitting on his pack, barefoot and shivering. He had a pair of muddy footprints smeared across his chest, but the man who'd called out to them took a single look before nodding his approval. "Frostbite, eh?" He rubbed his hands together, holding them towards the flames. "Most people don't know to do that. They heat the skin too fast." For whatever reason, this proved the perfect thing to say. With murmured greetings and shy smiles, the people behind him filed quickly out of the trees, gathering in a tight circle to warm themselves beside the fire. There were more of them than Kiera had originally thought, maybe 9 or 10, all wearing the same sun-faded clothing, all carrying the same scent of barley in their calloused hands. The travel wasn't new to them, not judging by the amount they were talking with them in the carts, nor was the concept of sharing a fire with strangers, because that instinctive shyness was quick to fade. "Where are your shoes?" Kiera glanced down in surprise as a tiny voice piped up beside her. The girl couldn't have been more than 6 years old, just a mop of tangled curls and a pair of truly enormous eyes. She smiled without thinking, crouching to the same height. "It was the silliest thing. I lost them in the river." A lot better than saying I lost them to a dragon. "You did?" "I had placed them on some rocks by the shore," she answered in a hush, "just long enough to take a quick swim. By the time I got back, they were gone. Perhaps they were stolen by a badger." The girl's eyes twinkled with merriment. "Or some fish." They shared a conspiratorial giggle as the girl's mother glanced over with a thoughtful smile. "She has a strapping man to carry her. No need for shoes." The child laughed again as Kiera stared across the fire with a blush. Jesse had relaxed his defensive posture and was speaking with the older man who'd called out to them before, listening more than speaking. No sooner would he try to interject than the man would interrupt in a burst of enthusiasm, and he'd fall silent again, nodding along with a smile. "Although I'm afraid he won't be around much longer," the woman continued, shaking her head with regret. "My father's telling him stories. He'll die of old age before they're through. There was another chorus of laughter as the woman reached into her pocket and fished out a bag of dried meat, just little morsels that had been shaved off the bigger flanks. Perfect snacks for the children on the trip. The girl took one eagerly before offering the bag to Kiera. Want one? I salted them myself. She took it with a smile, popping it into her mouth. Thank you. Like I said, what's the worst that could happen? We're actually heading down to a village called Cattling, the man concluded abruptly, blowing into his cupped hands. But the place was just wiped off the map, if you can believe it. Kiera raised her eyes slowly as Jessie flashed a look across the flames. Oh yes, he asked innocently. What happened? The man continued rubbing his hands, oblivious to the effect his words were having. It was a wildfire, or at least that's what they're saying. No one really knows for sure. No one was there. The breath caught in Kiera's chest as her ears started ringing. This is how it was reduced. This is how it will be remembered, not as a village full of people, full of promise, but as second-hand anecdote to be recounted to strangers around a shared fire. The world tilted, and her eyes stung with tears. But surely someone else must have seen what happened, she said with a hint of desperation, ignoring the look of warning on Jessie's face. Wildfires don't just touch down and then vanish. What of the surrounding forest? You say the village was destroyed, but what of the trees? A rough voice echoed across the clearing. That's the thing about wildfires. People seldom survive to tell the story. The friends turned at the same time, only to see yet another group of people walking towards them through the woods. While they bore some basic similarities, this one was much larger and consisted entirely of men. They asked for no permission. They just stepped up beside the fire. The one in front smiled, showing each of his teeth. But we shouldn't tell such terrible stories to such delicate creatures, he continued with mock chivalry, bowing his head with a grin. This one has tears in her eyes. Kiera lifted a hand to her cheek as Jessie appeared by her side. We should get moving, he murmured. She didn't question it for a moment. She merely slung the pack over her shoulder with a tight smile. It wasn't until they neared the edge of the clearing that she suddenly looked back. What about the rest of them? She asked softly, eyes flickering to the family. If these men are anything like how they appear, we can't just leave them. He shook his head impatiently. They'll be fine, this isn't our concern. But he trailed off when his eyes fell upon the children. They lingered there for a moment, torn with an emotion he couldn't control, before he glanced back at the newcomers. You're welcome to the fire, he called curtly. We were just leaving. Kiera cast a worried look at the old man, hoping he would take the hint and do the same, only to find that he was already leaving himself. The family might have been kind enough to share their food, but they'd long grown wise to the dangers of travel. The carts were packed, but not with anything of value. It was likely the men had already rifled through them and taken what they wished. Yes, we'll be leaving as well. The old man flashed a parting smile as the little girl waved by his side. We'd like to get a little farther before the sun goes down. Jessie nodded ever so slightly, meeting his gaze. Safe travels. And to you. The family vanished without another word, and only moments later, Kiera heard the wooden creak of the carts moving further up the road. She and Jessie were almost to the trail themselves, when there was a crackling of leaves, and a sudden hand appeared on her wrist. My apologies, darling. We didn't mean to frighten you away. She turned with a start to see the man who'd spoken to her before, standing just a short ways behind. He made no move to release her, just stared with that same unnerving smile. Nonsense, she laughed nervously, trying to reclaim her arm. We were just... You should stay for a while, he interrupted quietly. Don't worry about your friend. We could find something for him to do. He leaned even closer. Perhaps he'd like to watch. Jessie was between them a second later. Back off. She She blinked in amazement, staring at the back of his head. She had no idea how he'd moved that fast. She had no idea how anyone could move that fast. One moment it had been just the two of them. Then there was a violent crack, followed by a gasp of pain. Those imprisoning fingers disappeared, and her captive wrist returned to her side. The man stepped back with a look of surprise, shaking feeling back into his arm.
"Take a breath, friend. We meant no offense."
Jessie merely stood there, rigid as a statue.
"We have no quarrel,"
the man repeated clearly, looking wary yet slightly irritated at the same time.
"I was only teasing the girl. You're free to go on your way."
"Are you sure?" Jessie took a sudden step closer, cold rage simmering in his eyes. His voice was soft, but seemed to carry all the same. "Are we free to go? You're giving us permission." Kiera shrank back into the shadows, staring between them in confusion. She had no idea why he was pushing things when they'd been offered a chance to go. But then she had no idea why it was working. Instead of using the advantage of his 20 friends, the man took another step away.
"No need for permission,"
he mumbled, averting his eyes as much as he could.
"I'm sorry for the misunderstanding."
It was quiet for a moment. Then Jessie threw back his head with a burst of wild laughter. Kiera jumped in her skin, feeling like she'd never seen him before. The man startled as well, one hand drifting with a fearful expression to his blade. The sound travelled on long and loud, echoing in the clearing, resonating in the bones of every man standing inside. "A misunderstanding," he repeated when it was finally quiet, a frightening smile still lingering on his face. "That's how I'll remember it as well." Without another word, he placed a hand on the small of Kiera's back and gestured her forward, keeping his eyes fixed on the man at the same time. She walked past him as fast as she could without technically breaking into a run, appearing on the trail a moment later, only to find that the family and their train of wagons was already gone. What the heck just happened back there? Her body was trembling, though she didn't know the exact reason why. What did he just... Jessie appeared beside her a moment later, offering a courteous smile. "Shall we?" he asked, tilting his head towards the road. She stared at him a moment, then nodded quickly, falling into stride. Together, the two of them continued walking for many miles to come. Long after the wagons had vanished in one direction, and the men had disappeared in another. Long after the remains of that fire had withered to ash and smoke. Chapter 6. Kiera's eyes fluttered open slowly, her lashes catching the morning light. It was later than she'd thought, later than they had ever left before. Jessie had let her sleep in. "Jessie." She sat up quickly, glancing around the abandoned camp. "Hello?" In a moment of stark clarity, she realized she didn't want to call for him. She didn't want him to reply. Things had been blurry the night before, but she recognized that sinking feeling all too well. It wasn't as obvious as it might have been. For the last few days, the man had been travelling alongside her. They'd gathered food together, built fires together, laughed at each other's jokes. He'd rescued her from the point of oblivion, clothed her naked body, pressed her muddy feet to his skin. But in spite of all that, the feeling remained. It was the same flicker of dread she'd gotten in the tavern when the festivities had escalated and the whiskey had gone to the patrons' heads. The same prickling on the back of her neck as when she realized Talbot and Marcel were elsewhere and things had spiraled beyond her control. "I'm afraid of him." A sound pricked her ears, and she stood up quickly, wrapping the cloak around herself and gingerly stepping to the edge of the trees. It had taken ages to find a place to camp. Everywhere had looked pretty much the same to her, but he would frown at some unseen complication and shake his head. They had finally selected a little grove of alders, no different from any other, except it was angled to the east and surrounded by a bed of dried leaves. They'd crackled under her feet as she looked around. "Here?" she'd asked. He nodded, slinging down his pack. "Here." There had been no talking, no cooking. He seemed hesitant to light another fire, even for warmth, and both had lost all sense of an appetite just a few miles before. They'd gone to sleep with a simple goodnight, only for her to wake up the next morning and discover he had vanished. Not vanished, just strayed a little off the trail. She came to a sudden pause as she caught a glimpse of him deeper in the forest. Despite how ceaselessly attentive the man could be, his thoughts were clearly elsewhere now. There was a visible hesitation in the sureness of his steps, and those vibrant eyes were unable to settle upon anything in particular, drifting in endless circles before finally coming to a rest. On a tree. She watched in perfect silence as he knelt at the base of a pine, taking a little sprig of violet flowers from his pocket. As the breeze stirred up around them, he murmured a few words, kissed the blossoms, then laid them gently in the leaves, crossing himself in a gesture she'd never seen. A quiet sigh wilted his shoulders. An expression of indescribable sadness washed across his face. At that point, she realized she shouldn't be watching. Shit! She turned to leave, but he was already standing, striding back towards the camp with that same wistful expression. He stopped the instant he saw her, just as startled as she was. "You're awake," he said in surprise, glancing involuntarily back towards the trees. His cheeks flushed with a hint of colour, and he couldn't help but add, "How long were you—" "What happened yesterday?" she interrupted shortly. She hadn't intended to ask him. Certainly not at that moment. Quite possibly never at all. But the words flew out before she could stop them, hovering dangerously in space between them. His surprise hardened into something darker as those walls came up before her very eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about." "With those men," she said bluntly. "Those men you terrified by the fire." He hesitated a split second, then shook his head with a frown. "I didn't terrify anyone," he replied just as shortly. "The man was making a brutish proposition to you, and I told him to back away. Anything beyond that—" "That's a lie, and you know it," she said quietly. "And it started even before that. From the second those men stepped into the clearing, you didn't want them to see your face." He opened his mouth to answer, then pushed past her. "You may not have been travelling long, but you'll soon learn the wisest course of action is often to keep your head down and your business to yourself. I won't have you prying into mine." She caught him by the sleeve, refusing to budge. "This was more than mere discretion. There is something about you that was enough to make 20 armed men back away in fear." She hesitated, weighing the rest. "We hike together each day, sleep together each night. Tell me what I'm missing. I have a right to know." For a split second, she thought it had worked. His lips parted uncertainly, and for the briefest moments, those impenetrable walls that defended him seemed to waver and crack. Then, just as quickly, the moment passed. "You have no right whatsoever," he answered coldly. "I am here only in kindness, and my assurance I'd never harm you should be enough. If that no longer suffices, it's not my problem." She stared a moment with a measured gaze, then nodded her head. "Safe travels." Without a backwards glance, she swept out of the clearing, taking a handful of the roots they'd gathered, before leaving the campsite behind and heading back to the main path. He stared after her in shock. "You can't be serious," he finally managed, hurrying after her. "Where will you go?" "To the Fae stronghold," she answered promptly, keeping her eyes on the horizon and wishing she'd grabbed the berries instead of the roots. "I apologize for the cloak. Rest assured, if our paths ever cross again, I'll find a way to compensate you for it." He circled in front of her, hands raised in his best approximation of calm. "What are you doing?" Ah, the condescending male tone. Love it. She continued walking as if he wasn't there. "You frightened me. I have enough reasons already to be afraid." He flinched as though he'd been struck. "You don't even know which direction—" "Of course I do." She gestured with a vague wave of her hand. "That way. We're only a day or so away from a fortress of immortals, Jessie. This road will soon be filled with travellers who've come from that exact place. I'll ask one of them to direct me." "Kiera." "Why do you care?" she demanded, turning abruptly to face him. "We met only a few days ago. I've done nothing but cost you time and supplies since then. Why do you care if I go?" For a moment, it looked as though he was asking himself the same question. His eyes flashed and his jaw clenched in frustration, while those long fingers balled into fists at his sides. Then, all at once, that infinite composure broke. Because I know you now." He threw up his hands in exasperation. "Because I saw you cry, Kiera. Because we shared a fire. Because you're a young woman travelling by herself, and I can't begin to imagine all the terrible things that will happen to you on the road." She stared up at him a moment longer, then continued walking. "We don't know each other at all. You've made that perfectly clear." For the next half a day, Kiera and Jessie engaged in a silent battle of wills. She continued on her journey towards the Fae, while he pretended not to be doing the same thing. When she hiked up a mountain, he shadowed her footsteps. When she half tumbled down the other side, he suppressed a sigh and followed as well. When she got lost and looped around in the wrong direction, he simply waited where he was until she eventually circled back to him. It was humiliating, infuriating, and a complete violation of trust. It was also a little bit fun. "I'm hungry," she mused, trailing her fingers along the dew-tipped ferns as she pontificated to the clouds. "If only I could stumble upon a dead rabbit, or maybe even a squirrel. Freshly dead, preferably skinned, but of course you can't be choosy when it comes to gifts from the fates." Just a stone's throw behind her, Jessie rolled his eyes with a smile. "Perhaps I should try these berries," she added, studying the blood-red sprig by the side of the path. "I know some are poisonous, but these look to be—" A rock sailed between them, knocking the branch straight out of her hand. She stared a moment, then continued blithely on her way. "On second thought, I've never really liked berries. The juice gets everywhere, stains your hands." The next few hours were more of the same. The two continued walking in distant parallels, both determined to ignore the other, both finding it harder and harder to contain their laughter as they trudged with a complete lack of focus through the endless redwood trees. Since Jessie wasn't technically supposed to be there, Kiera spoke for both of them, playing out each side of the conversation with a specific emphasis on her own brilliance and a brooding impression that made another rock come flying through the trees. The anger that had driven them apart was long forgotten. It was simply too hard to sustain when they were the only people out wandering through the endless miles of woods. "Everyone's entitled to a few secrets. Just because I shared mine doesn't mean—" Her thoughts trailed off as she came to a stop at the edge of a swift-moving river. There was a bridge not far in the distance, but the storm hadn't been kind, and the weathered posts had seen better days. The water itself was ice-cold and moving too quickly to traverse in any other location. Perhaps it lessened into something manageable, but that would be ages downstream. The last traces of a smile vanished from her face. "Jessie?" It was too serious a question for her not to ask, and with consequences that she couldn't possibly hope to survive. People drowned every year in precisely such a river. It was the reason those who frequented the trails had finally pulled together and constructed themselves a bridge. Such as it is. He was by her side a moment later, staring at the water with troubled eyes. Twice his gaze drifted to the rickety planks of wood before he abruptly shook his head. "It's too dangerous. We'll have to go around." She let out a deflating breath, pushing her hair back.
"But it's right there."
"What?" He raised his eyebrows expectantly. "The broken bridge or the freezing current rushing underneath? We'll have to go around, there's no other way." She flashed him a look before gazing longingly at the opposite bank.
"Except the bridge."
"Kiera."
"How do you know it's unsteady?" she reasoned, turning to face him. "All those wagons and people we saw before, they must have crossed and survived." "Wagons, Jesse. Heavy carts."
"There are several paths those carts might have travelled," he argued, "and judging by the complete lack of tracks anywhere around this place, I'm guessing the bridge wasn't one of them." He was right. He was completely right. And if given the chance, she most certainly would have gone back and reconsidered her decision. But her sense of adventure was stirring. The opposite shore was within reach, and she refused to believe that her waifish figure could possibly change things. "I'm going to cross." She started marching forward, only for him to immediately leap into her path. A hand locked protectively around her arm, as those piercing green eyes glared down into hers. "This game we've been playing? Let me be clear. I'm not playing anymore. If you take a step onto that bridge, it will break, and you'll fall to your death. You cannot survive that river." She made a useless attempt to reclaim her arm.
"I'll be careful."
"It isn't a matter of being careful."
"Get your hands off me!"
The words rang out between them, somehow managing to rise above even the thundering echoes of the rushing current. For a suspended moment, the two of them locked eyes. Then his hand disappeared.
"I'll be careful,"
she said again, blushing in embarrassment. She hadn't meant to raise her voice like that. Old habits from the tavern died hard.
"And it'll be fine, you'll see."
But he was no longer standing beside her. In fact, he was backing away.
"Jessie, it will be fine."
He simply stared at her, lingering a moment as if to immortalize the image, before turning on his heel and walking away. Within seconds, he'd vanished into the trees, leaving her standing alone on the shore of the river, feeling like she'd made a terrible mistake.
"You didn't,"
she told herself, staring up the incline towards the posts.
"This will be fine. He doesn't construct bridges for a living. The guy made a snap decision based on a gut feeling, nothing more."
Her eyes flashed to the trees before returning to the bridge.
"Nothing more."
With a huff of determination, she hiked up the slope, forcing herself not to look down as thick gusts of mist blew off the rushing water, sticking tendrils of hair to the sides of her face. The ground was slick, but not unmanageable. It was swaying though there wasn't any breeze, as though the water itself was creating such momentum that even though they were merely adjacent, it couldn't help but play along. She ran her fingers along the railing, giving it an experimental shake. Nothing happened. She shook the boards again, then became convinced Jessie had made a mistake. With a look of measured confidence, she eased carefully over the water, trying to control her frantic breathing as the wood beneath her trembled and shook. At several points, she froze in place, letting things settle, regaining her balance. The swaying lessened somewhat, and before she knew it, she was standing right in the middle of the bridge.
"See? Everything's fine."
She fixed her eyes on the opposite shoreline.
"I just need to get a little bit farther."
There was a harsh crack, followed by a soft gasp as the board splintered and the bridge suddenly gave out beneath her. With time for nothing more than a single breathless cry, she found herself falling for what felt like an unending moment before plunging into the icy waters below. It was so cold. Never had she felt such a thing. Never had she known it existed. It was the kind of cold that dulled the mind and shocked the senses. The kind of cold that blocked out thoughts like, "I should move my legs," and "I'm probably going to die," replacing them with those looping words. It was so cold. She opened her mouth with an involuntary scream, then found herself flipping head over feet, dragged along at such an impossible pace she could no longer tell which way was down and which way was up. Every crystallized moment had been reduced to its base feelings, and almost all of those were some degree of astonishment as to the breathtaking, excruciating cold. Splinters of light stabbed into her vision. There were swirls of bubbles, searing flashes of pain. At one point, her head struck against something along the bottom. Then, all at once, the world seemed to go still. Her first thought was that it had to be a dream. She'd hit her head. She was dreaming. What else could explain the hazy figure diving towards her out of the light? It hit the water like an explosion, letting out a sharp cry before beginning to swim. Like a backlit arrow, it sliced through the water, getting closer and closer, emerging from the haze. She let out another waterlogged scream, flailing backwards. For a frozen moment, she had imagined it was Jesse. They were the only two people for miles. He'd have heard the splash, and for however many times she'd chided his warily standoffish approach to people, there wasn't a doubt in her mind that he'd have thrown himself in. But it wasn't Jesse. It was what every child of the forest grew up fearing. It was an enormous, bloodthirsty wolf. A rush of blind panic came over her, cutting through even the disorientation and pain of the sweeping tides. With a frenzied kind of desperation, she tried to scramble out of its trajectory, but found her palsied limbs completely unable to move. Another wild scream tore out of her, muting in the water between them, as the creature defied the strength of the river itself and drew close enough that she could see the glint of its eyes. This is it, she realized in astonishment. This is how I'm going to die. Then its massive jaws closed around her shoulder, and she could remember no more. Chapter 7. If the fates had been even the least bit merciful, Kiera wouldn't have remembered what happened next. She would have blacked out a moment before the nightmarish predator jumped after her into the water, and would have had no recollection of it dragging her to dry land. But the fates had been mercurial as of late. "Let go!" she screeched, flailing like a fish caught in a line, as the wolf struggled against the current, trying to make its way back to shore. "You wretched beast, let me go!" She had gasped back into consciousness the second her head broke free of the water, and from that moment on she had made it her life's mission to get back into the river, to die. Better to drown than be eaten alive. There isn't enough game wandering around the forest. It had to jump into a freezing river just to attack me? Another scream ripped through her teeth as she thrashed and kicked, twisting around in the beast's jaws to scratch violently at its eyes. Such predators might be virtually indestructible, but every creature under the sun had a weak point. In a blessed commonality, those were usually the same. "Jessie!" she screamed, fighting back with every bit of strength she had left. "Help!" "He can't hear you. He's gone." A fractured breath escaped her lips. And what could he do but watch? She had seen wolves before, though never in such terrifying proximity. There was a pack that used to wander the woods around cattling, before the men of the village had gone out one morning with swords and flaming clubs to drive them away. 30 broad-shouldered labourers, and 9 of them didn't come back. Like bears and some big cats, wolves were dangerous under the best of circumstances, and deadly if approached. The best chance one had was to avoid them altogether. And all of those wolves had been a lot smaller than this. In her wildest dreams, she could never have imagined such a beast. It was as though it had been scaled to a world much larger than her own. Those powerful legs were making headway against a raging current, and the jaws that ensnared her could surely crush stone. She sucked in a gulp of water, imagining the worst. Perhaps I'll bleed out before it starts taking bites of me. Perhaps it will get careless and... There was a sharp cry, and the two of them sank abruptly beneath the waves. In the chaos that followed, it was difficult to say what exactly happened. There was a wild thrashing, followed by the slow rise of crimson bubbles, though the teeth around her shoulder were fixed as gently as could be. It wasn't until the churning water suddenly cleared that she realized what had happened, that she saw the submerged cluster of rocks that had snagged the wolf by the paw. No matter what the creature tried, it was unable to free itself. Bone had been wedged into rock with the strength of the river itself. Without the tools of men, there was no dislodging it. It was certain death for the wolf. But for her, there was a glimmer of opportunity. Without stopping to consider whether or not it might work, she forced her body to go limp, drifting along in the current like the remains of a tattered flag. The wolf abandoned its frantic attempts to free itself, lifting its head in surprise to see what had happened. Then, with a final burst of strength, she kicked it with all the force she could muster, right in the center of the head. There was a muffled crunch as bone struck bone, another surge of blood in the water. Its mouth opened in a reflexive yelp, and in that split second of freedom, she yanked her arm loose and was carried immediately away on the current, watching as the wolf grew smaller and smaller in the distance, before disappearing into the haze. Fortunately, she wasn't carried too far. The animal had dragged them almost all the way free of the churning waters. With a desperate reach, she was able to grab hold of one of the passing rocks and heave her body out of the water, crawling with a ragged gasp onto the shore. The world was spinning. Colours pulsated, always too bright, and while she was aware she must be technically freezing, she cringed at the burning sun on the back of her neck. Breathe. Just breathe. For another few seconds, she merely lay there, her forehead pressed to the cool pebbles, her lungs throbbing painfully as she sucked in gasps of the mountain air. She felt like a part of her was still falling. She felt like another part was still trapped beneath those icy waves. Then, very slowly, she turned to the river. Is it dead? She needed no time to consider. The visceral memory of those feral teeth reaching for her skin was enough. She'd rolled the dice with the bridge. She wouldn't do the same with the wolf. In the beginning, she merely inched backwards, cutting her palms against the sharp gravel, keeping her eyes locked upon the river at all times. Then, once she'd gained enough courage, she pushed to her feet and sprinted in the opposite direction, leaving the nightmare behind. At least, that's what she tried to do. The moment she placed weight on her legs, they buckled beneath her. The moment she raised herself vertical, the sky started spinning and she landed right back on the ground. Her eyes flew again to the river. Then she picked up a rock. If it comes out, I'll kill it. A few seconds passed. It's not coming out. A few more seconds. Definitely not coming out. She lowered the rock to her side. Yes, it's definitely... There was an explosion of water as a figure rose from the river, sinking almost as fast with a breathless cry. It had appeared in the exact place she'd just escaped herself, right in the middle of the rushing current. But it wasn't a wolf that had burst into the sunlight. It was a man. Jesse? By the time she made the connection, staring in paralyzed astonishment, he had already slipped back out of sight, reaching a hand towards the heavens as he vanished beneath the waves. It happened so fast, she almost thought she'd imagined it. Then she found herself calling his name. Jesse! There was a splashing from further downstream, a head of dark hair trapped in the deadly grip of the river. It punished and battered his body, tossing him about like a rag doll. He made a frantic grab for some low-hanging branches, but his fingers were stiff with the cold, and the current was carrying him along too fast. When he tried again, he managed to catch the crook of 2 rocks, dragging his body from the water, before collapsing on the shore. "Jessie!" She was on her feet a second later, staggering forward with a shocking lack of coordination, her bare feet slipping on the stones. Twice she fell in the process, scraping her knees open on the overabundance of rocks. Twice she forced herself back up, stumbling across the bank to his side. His eyes were closed, and he wasn't moving. The only reason he hadn't slipped back into the water was because he'd managed to wedge his arm between the rocks. He was also naked. In a rush of panic, these things slipped in and out of her mind. "It's okay," she gasped, sinking to the ground beside him. "It's going to be okay, Jessie. Can you hear me? We need to get you out of the water." To be honest, they needed to do a hell of a lot more than that, and given the present circumstances, she had no idea how they were going to get it done. He was unresponsive. It was a miracle she'd been able to move, and the second she loosened his arm, not to mention what else might be lurking in the water. "I need you to work with me here," she pleaded softly, slipping on the slick stone. "Just give me a sign, okay? Open your eyes, wiggle your fingers, yell at me. I certainly deserve it." He simply lay there, blood swirling in the water around him, a single arm caught in that outcropping of rocks. Bizarrely enough, he looked almost peaceful, with his eyes closed in slumber, tendrils of dark hair curling around his face. If it wasn't for the frightening pallor of his skin. "He doesn't look peaceful. He looks like a corpse." "Just rest, okay? I've got this." With a silent prayer, she waded back into the water, looping his free arm around her neck and wondering what on earth had happened to his clothes. Once she was steady enough, she took his captive hand and gave it a sharp tug, wincing as it sliced open on the jagged rocks. "I'm sorry," she breathed, pulling even harder, "but the longer we leave you in here—" There was a sharp cry as his arm came free, sliding him back into the water. She plunged in after him, tightening her grip on his wrist, but his eyes had fluttered open, blinking around in a daze. "What?" "It's all right," she panted, heaving him towards the shore. "It's going to be all right. You were in that water for a while, but we're both out now. Everything's fine." Not really. It was impossible to determine how much had been lost to shock, but judging by the vacant look in his eyes, she was guessing not much had penetrated the haze. While she was straining with all her might, trying to get them back to shore, he simply lay with his body half submerged in the water, taking sudden little breaths and blinking drops of water from his eyes. "Jessie?" She tried to control the panic in her voice, giving his hand a comforting squeeze. "We need to get out of the river now, okay? The water's too cold and you've been in too long." Her eyes flashed back to the splashing current. "There also might be a wolf." For the first time, the words seemed to register. He flashed her a quick look before pushing suddenly to his feet, wading out of the rushing water until they were both standing back on the shore. She wanted to press him further, but a single look at his face and she stopped. "I can't believe that just happened," she murmured, still trying to catch her breath. Their arms were still locked together, and she flashed a faint smile. "I didn't even see you jump in." She trailed off into silence, staring at him for the first time. That's when she noticed the deep gouge in his hand and the scratches around his eyes. When his head bowed in exhaustion, trails of blood streamed down his face. "It was you." She let out a breath of astonishment. "You're the wolf." He met her eyes for a fleeting moment, then face-planted on the ground. "He's a shifter." A full minute had passed, but Kiera was rooted to the spot, staring at her companion like she'd never seen him before. In a way, she hadn't. In a way, she'd never seen any shifter, not really. The magical creatures of the land tended to move in a tight-knit circles, keeping those outside the circle at an arm's length. The shifters who came into the tavern were always men. She had never seen them look any different. "A shifter," she breathed, needing to say it aloud. "You shift into a wolf." He raised his bleary eyes before pushing weakly to his feet. "And you're a lot smarter than people give you credit for." She stared at him in silence, too astonished to reply. It was the answer to a dozen silent questions, one she hadn't realized she'd been wondering herself. It was the reason he heard so well and moved so fast, the way he walked through the forest without making a sound and held his own against 20 armed men back in the clearing, the way he saved my life in the river. He stood up for only a moment, then collapsed to one knee, clutching at his shoulder and shivering violently in the cold. A few drops of blood trickled down from his chin, sprinkling the pebbly shoreline. He glanced at them in surprise, then lifted a trembling hand to his face. "I'm sorry," she murmured, suddenly realizing she'd never be able to say it enough. "When I saw you in the river, I didn't realize." Her eyes filled with tears. "I was just trying to get away." He took a single look at her face, then shook his head. "Don't be sorry," he answered roughly, tangles of hair spilling into his eyes. "If I had been honest with you, it never would have happened." "Why weren't you?" For a split second, she considered asking. Then she knelt gently by his side. "Come on, let's get you dry." As quickly as she could manage, Kiera ran along the shoreline to recover Jesse's clothes, before doubling back to manhandle him away from the river and into the forest. In water that cold, time was everything. The longer a person stayed submerged, the greater the chance that they would never be able to recover. Jesse was tougher than most, but he had some strong thoughts on the matter. "For the love of the gods, bloody release my hand!" She smiled sweetly and continued dragging him towards the trees, calmly resisting all his attempts to escape. In his present condition, it was very much like trying to restrain a small child. If that child had fallen repeatedly on their head. "We're almost there," she said soothingly, adjusting her grip. "You're doing great."
"Burn in Hades, devil woman."
She patted him on the back. "That's right, honey. Keep your chin up." Unable to do anything more than glare, he allowed himself to be shuffled awkwardly into the woods, shaking so dramatically he was scarcely able to stand. The second they could no longer hear the rushing water, she lowered him onto the pine needles and proceeded to make a fire. At least she proceeded to try. "Come on," she muttered, striking desperately at the flint. "It isn't working." "That's because you're doing a bad job." "Charming." She knelt over it once again, grimacing in frustration when her wet hair dripped onto the stones. Her own hands were trembling to the point where she could barely keep them steady, and she could hear her ill-tempered saviour's teeth chattering all the way from the trees. "Jesse, talk to me. How are you doing?" "Come on, just light." When there was no answer, she called again. "Jesse?" "I'm fine," he answered softly, not a trace of that delightful rebellion that made her want to strangle him before. "Don't worry about the fire. I'm just going to rest my eyes." She threw a panicked look over her shoulder before dropping the stones. "Wake up!" Without a second thought, she abandoned the fire and sprinted back to him, fumbling with the clasp on her cloak at the same time. She didn't have to be a healer to recognize the onset of hypothermia. She'd seen it all too often in her village, and in conditions a lot less severe than this. "Hey, none of that!" she commanded, dropping to her knees beside him and lightly slapping at his cheeks. "Come on, I'm serious. Stay with me." He cracked open his eyes, trying not to slur. "Stop hitting me." "You might have grown up somewhere cold," she answered, battling the heavy fabric. "But it clearly wasn't by a river. That water is too cold, and you were in there too long. Your body's going into shock. That's why you feel tired. That's why you can't sleep." He considered this a moment, then shook his head. "That doesn't make sense." "It would if you were thinking clearly." She finally yanked the clasp free, tossing it on the ground and draping the cloak to enfold them both. "We need to get you heated up, or you'll die." Under different circumstances, she might not have been so blunt, but he was fading quickly, drifting in and out of consciousness before her very eyes. With a rising sense of panic, she wrapped herself around him, entwining them as much as possible, and shivering at the chill coming from his skin. There wasn't a hint of response, not a thing to reassure her, just his shallow breaths, his racing pulse, and the faint bluish tint around the corners of his lips. "Jessie!" She rubbed desperately at his arms, crushing them both together. If only she wasn't so cold herself, it might have a better chance at working. As it stood, they were both shivering. A part of her was terrified it would continue. A part of her was terrified he would suddenly stop. "Please, please don't let him die." For a few agonizing minutes, she was convinced it was too late, that she would eventually lift her head and realize she was clutching a corpse. Then, very slowly, his body came back to life beneath her. His heartbeat quickened and became stronger. His fingers twitched in her hair. She pulled back just a few inches, casting a tentative look at his face, only to see those green eyes staring into hers. An overpowering sense of relief swept over her, warming into a radiant smile. "Welcome back." He blinked a few times, still shivering. Then his eyes swept over the copse of trees. Most of it would fade from memory. Most already had. But he had enough clarity to latch onto a single thing. "You're naked." A flaming blush coloured her cheeks. "I'm jumping back into the river."